The COVID-19 pandemic was not a public health crisis. It was a coordinated military operation. The COVID dossier, a detailed compilation of evidence, unveils the disturbing reality of how military and intelligence agencies worldwide took control of the pandemic response. What was presented to the public as a health emergency, managed by public health officials, was in truth shaped and executed through national security frameworks typically reserved for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear warfare. The dossier reveals how the pandemic was treated as a military operation, with organizations like the US Department of Defense, the Canadian Armed Forces, NATO, and other global defense alliances playing pivotal roles in orchestrating the response. Countries such as the US, UK, Canada, Germany, and Italy had military and intelligence agencies leading their responses, with efforts aimed at implementing emergency laws typically used for bioweapons attacks. The dossier highlights how the US government activated the Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA, and the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness, or PrEP Act, in early 2020. Both of which are legal frameworks designed for the deployment of countermeasures during a weapons of mass destruction attack. This indicates that from the very beginning, the pandemic response was shaped by the tools and tactics used for warfare, not health crises. The EUA in particular stands out as it allowed for the rapid deployment of countermeasures, which included vaccines, without the usual regulatory oversight. More significantly, the EUA legally shielded vaccine manufacturers and administrators from legal liability. This legal immunity was granted a full month and a half before lockdowns even began, ensuring that those involved in the development and distribution of the vaccine were free from any potential legal repercussions, regardless of the long-term effects or safety concerns. What's more, the US military first approached Moderna about developing a COVID-19 vaccine in early January 2020, even before the virus had made its way to the US in any significant capacity. The virus had not even reached American shores by the time the military was already directing pharmaceutical companies to create experimental vaccines for a threat that had yet to materialize. Why was the military so eager to start working on a vaccine for a virus that had barely impacted the US, and why were these countermeasures pushed forward before any real public health emergency had even been established? The military's role in this process was pivotal, not just in deploying emergency protocols, but in directly engaging with vaccine manufacturers, including Moderna, which was approached early by the US military to develop a COVID-19 vaccine under these extraordinary legal frameworks. The collaboration between the US government and Moderna was part of Operation Warp Speed, a program designed to accelerate vaccine development by providing funding and resources. But this early involvement of the military raises questions about the true nature of the response to the pandemic. Was the goal to protect public health, or was it about something far larger? The dossier also sheds light on the significant role of military intelligence and biodefense alliances in orchestrating this global response. It underscores the use of information operations, a term that encompasses both psychological operations and more traditional methods of controlling public perception. These operations were not limited to wartime, but were actively deployed during a public health crisis, with military agencies taking charge of the narrative. Propaganda techniques and surveillance strategies were implemented worldwide, painting a picture of a globally coordinated operation, not a decentralized health response. In Canada, these global dynamics played out in full force. The Canadian government and military saw the pandemic as an opportunity to test out propaganda techniques and experiment with surveillance on its population. In April 2020, the Canadian Joint Operations Command, or CJOC, initiated a covert information operations campaign aimed at shaping public perception of government measures. The campaign was designed to manage the narrative surrounding the pandemic and preempt civil disobedience. What's more striking is that this operation was undertaken without the explicit approval of the federal government. According to an investigation, CJOC moved forward with the campaign despite the fact that its stated purpose of shaping and exploiting public information went against policies meant to limit military influence on domestic affairs. The CJOC saw the pandemic as a unique opportunity to experiment with information warfare on Canadians. One of the commanders involved referred to the situation as a learning opportunity for military personnel, which further blurred the lines between military training exercises and real-world information operations. The techniques employed were drawn from military strategies originally developed in conflict zones like Afghanistan, where shaping public opinion was a crucial component of achieving operational goals. In other words, Canadian citizens were subjected to the same manipulation tactics that the government once used against the Taliban. And when you consider that the government sent in heavily armed forces to assault peaceful Canadians while freezing the bank accounts of those deemed guilty of dissent, it's hard not to see the disturbing parallel. It's clear that, for the Canadian government, the distinction between a citizen and a terrorist is just as blurry as the line between information operations and psychological warfare, also known as brainwashing. On top of the military-led propaganda, the Canadian government engaged in extensive surveillance of its citizens. The Public Health Agency of Canada, or PHAC, revealed that it had tracked the movement of 33 million mobile devices throughout the pandemic, which equated to roughly 87% of the Canadian population at the time. This data, collected under the guise of evaluating lockdown measures and understanding the spread of COVID-19, raises serious questions about privacy and government overreach. The scale of this surveillance was not limited to the pandemic's initial phases. It was a widespread and sustained effort to monitor Canadians' movements and behaviors. In a baffling twist, the CBC itself reported on the issue, attempting to dismiss claims that the military was engaging in psyops. Yet they contradicted their own narrative by admitting, quote, "The line between psychological warfare and information operation campaigns has become increasingly blurry over the last few years." In essence, the CBC is confirming that these operations, whether they are labeled as psychological operations or not, share the same core objectives: shaping and controlling public perception, making the CBC's own reporting a perfect example of a government-backed psyop in itself. Every day, it becomes more apparent that COVID was not just a pandemic, it was a global coup orchestrated to erode civil liberties and surrender national sovereignty to organizations like the UN, NATO, WHO, and the WEF. The pandemic served as a convenient cover for a coordinated effort to dismantle individual freedoms, centralize power, and reshape the global order. The scale of the deception is staggering, and the consequences for our nations have been dire. There is no viable path forward until those accountable for what can only be described as one of the most widespread crimes against humanity in history are held to justice. Anything less than global Nuremberg-style trials, where those responsible for this atrocity are brought to account, would be a disgrace. Until that happens, the shadow of this atrocity will continue to loom over our futures.